Let's go. Here is my story. Today's story is about receiving an email from one of my business competitors. When I opened it, I was shocked to see a picture of my wife attached. What I saw, I could not accept, and I could never imagine my wife as a cheater. Well, my friends, let's go to the story and see what was in that email. When plotting revenge, first dig 2 graves. I first heard this saying at the ripe old age of 25, when an early career mentor offered the sage advice in an attempt to diffuse my anger. He was successful. A few weeks later, when I looked back on the affront, I realized that it had indeed been minor. The advice stayed with me, and numerous times after, when feeling attacked, I would take comfort in the words. In fact, I ended up using it as something of a safe spot, convincing myself that I was being the mature professional by letting go of the slight, whether it was perceived or real. Update: I met my wife, Mary Helen, whom I simply call Helen, when I was 27, and she was 25. We hit it off pretty fast, finding we shared the same likes and carried similar opinions in most areas. It helped that she was a very attractive young woman that met most of the characteristics I like. She is tallish, 5'8", and slender with long, lovely legs. She has a cute smiling that always disarms me. Similarly, I think she likes how I am put together. She is always quick to say that she likes bigger guys. And at 6 and 190 pounds, I certainly fit that description. Still, I would call myself more rugged than handsome. Quite happy to have her as the looks winner in the family. Our dating progressed to the serious stage quite swiftly, as I think both of us were ready to settle down. So, 133 months after our initial introduction, we were standing at the altar of the Catholic Church, saying our vows. The next 7 years seemed to fly by, and we were blessed with 2 wonderful children, our son Greg and our daughter Sally. Things seemed near perfect, and besides success in our family life, my career was also doing quite well. I had left the corporate world 2 years after we got married, and with Helen's full support, had started my own business. Amazingly, it had proved successful almost from the start, and we were now doing quite well. Actually, we were doing better than well, which had allowed my wife to quit her job and concentrate on the family. In addition, she was active in the church and did some volunteer work with several nonprofits. For fun, our success had also allowed us to afford nice things. And during our marriage, we had progressed from our initial apartment through a starter home to the large residence we now enjoyed. It had been almost a perfect run. And looking back, I should have paid more attention to how good things were going. I first met J.D. Thornton at a customer function. They were having a reception for key suppliers, and we were introduced by the VP of Procurement. We engaged in a brief conversation, and I learned enough to know that he wasn't a competitor, but that he was quite full of himself. It became almost comical to listen to him talk, and several times when glancing at the customer, he winked at me to let me know he thought the same. After that, months went by, and I had completely forgotten about him, when one day, I got a call from him on my cell phone. "Hey man, this is J.D. Thornton. Remember we met a while ago?" He belted out quickly, bringing back the memory of our brief conversation. "Hello, what can I do for you? I wanted to see if you were available for lunch. I have a business idea I'd like to discuss that I think could be beneficial for both of us," he explained reluctantly. I agreed, and the following week found us in a booth in a small out-of-the-way diner. We had just sat down when he got a phone call, and quickly he was in the middle of a loud conversation. While annoyed at the distraction, it did give me an opportunity to size the man up. I guess JD was around 40, and he looked to be a couple of inches taller than me. In total, I took him to be a man that was more focused on business than his appearance. "Sorry about that," he mumbled when he ended the call a couple of minutes later. "Yeah, no problem," I replied, then continued, "What do you have in mind?" "Let's order first. I'm starved," he answered. He waved the waitress over, and when she left, we idly chatted about random things until our food arrived. Only when we were almost finished did he broach the subject of the meeting. "Look, I think between our 2 companies, we have the capabilities to replace the supplier for the Neptune product line. You have a solid supply chain for the technical components, and my fabricators in Mexico can bring in the structural elements very cheap. I'm thinking we join up and see what we can do," he explained. Surprisingly, his idea had merit. A lot of merit, actually, and I sat up in my chair as the potential sank in. We spent another hour discussing the concept, and then agreed that we would spend some time the following week getting into details. For the next few days, I pulled together some information to get prepared and also did some back-of-the-envelope calculations on the idea's potential. Conservatively, it looked like I could add 30% to the income of my business, and the best part was it could be done with almost no investment. The meeting the following week went well, and we put together a straw man of the new venture, including the business structure. We talked about approaching the customer and presenting our plan. But JD was adamant that we wait until we had developed it further. We agreed that the next step was due diligence on the supply chain, so as soon as we finished, I set up meetings with my key suppliers. Over the next month, we met with them, and although I thought it would be prudent to visit his fabricators in Mexico, JD wanted to wait until we finished the technical due diligence. So far, things had gone exceedingly well, and my enthusiasm was evident to Helen. I had been holding off telling her about the opportunity until it had more legs, but finally I was forced to. "What's got you so giddy?" she asked, then added, "You've been buzzing for weeks." I started to laugh from her description and then explained, "I'm working on a new business idea that I think will be very good. It should make us a lot of money. Don't you think we have enough money?" she asked, although I knew part of it was meant as a tease. "Keeping you looking good is expensive," I said instantly, knowing I chose my words poorly. "Oh, really?" she replied as her left eyebrow arched. "Sorry, that didn't come out right," I followed. "I would hope not," she said, fighting annoyance. Later that night, as soon as the kids were in bed, we made slow, satisfying love. "You're so proud of yourself. I think this business thing has made you hot?" she asked. "You make me hot, and the business thing is to take care of the family," I answered. "Honey, if it works, maybe we can give some to the church," she whispered while snuggling closer. Helen's caring soul was one of the things I loved so much about her. It wasn't the first time she had communicated she had all she wanted and wanted to help others. Certainly, her work with the church and the nonprofits played a part, but I knew it was something central to her as well. Even without those influences, I think she would have made a similar request. "We'll see," I replied, pulling her tightly against me. I'm not naturally optimistic or enthusiastic when it comes to business matters, as experience has taught me it was far better to be deliberate and maintain an even keel. However, I was breaking this tenet with the new venture. There was a J-ness in my step, excitement in my day-to-day dealings, and a smile that I couldn't get off my face. Thus, I didn't pick up on the message at first when JD suddenly went radio silent. I had been trying to contact him through phone calls and emails for almost a week when I realized something was amiss. And during a phone call with one of my long-term suppliers, the reality was suddenly made clear. "Hey, I thought you and JD were working on this Neptune thing together." Ron, the technical manager at the supplier, asked at the end of an unrelated call. "We are," I answered. "Okay, do well. I think you might want to look into it," he said, showing obvious discomfort before adding, "Give Sam a call." Sam or Samantha was an older woman that handled contracts for the company, and as soon as I ended the call with Ron, I was on the phone to her. "Sam, what's going on?" I asked after the normal pleasantries. "It's confidential," she started. Then, no doubt thinking about the years we had known each other, she said, "The guy JD said he was going to go this alone." Update 1. Now it was all suddenly very clear. JD Thornton had used me, manipulated me to get knowledge of the supply chain, and once educated, was now going to cut me out. It was a bad trick, but thinking about it, I realized I shouldn't be surprised. My initial thoughts on him were not positive, but I had allowed my interest in the deal and the eagerness to make money to overcome my concerns. It took another 2 weeks to get the complete picture, and in that time, I learned that he had contacted all my suppliers and even made a presentation to the customer. I seethed as I realized all this had been done behind my back with definite malice. "Hey, JD, I said through the phone, with dismissive arrogance. It had taken 2 more weeks to get him to answer, and I suspected he felt he now had the deal with a bow around it, making me no longer a threat. Thus, he could enjoy the win while taking the opportunity to rub my nose in it. "JD, I'd just like to hear in your own words what you're thinking," I asked, immediately feeling the inadequacy of the message. "Wrong," he laughed. "Wrong. I'm going to make a lot of money," he replied, and then hung up. Stunned, infuriated, angry, 1,000 feelings swept through my body for the next few days, like being on a Ferris wheel enduring a never-ending cycle. Then very slowly, one thought began to separate from the others: revenge. I wanted to kick JD in the balls and have him feel the deep humiliation that I was experiencing. Looking back, that desire was so powerful it blocked me from all-round rational thought. Amazingly, I was able to set aside my emotions as I plotted my revenge and created an attack strategy. First, I intended to reach out to 2 suppliers that I knew were essential to the deal and use my long-term relationship to try and convince them to drop JD. Then, I intended to strike back. His line of business wasn't all that differentiated, so I was hopeful that with some work, I would be able to find others that at least would threaten his customer base. Carl Westbrook was the owner of the primary supply company, and I had known him for almost 10 years. He was in his early 70s, one of those men that would likely die within weeks of retiring. And although our relationship had always been positive, I wasn't sure what to expect sitting in his office. I explained the situation in detail, leaving nothing out, while he leaned back in his chair and took it all in. "Okay, what else you got?" he asked when I was done. His answer confused me, so I asked, "What do you mean, Carl?" "Duck him is what I mean. "I'm too old to work with that bast," he answered. Then, after a pause, he leaned across the desk and started again. "How long have I known you?" 10 years. In all that time, you've never been anything but straightforward and honest. You know how rare that is." "Thanks, Carl," I replied with emotion. "Duck him, he's in his hall," he reiterated. The next supplier wasn't as straightforward, and it took some pleading on my part. However, I was eventually able to get them to agree to cut off ties with JD, too. I had to promise that I would do everything I could to replace the volume they were foregoing. But if my plan worked, I knew that wouldn't be a problem. I was pleasantly surprised with the success of the first phase of my plan. I had thought it might take more time, more convincing, but there seemed to be a consistent distaste for JD, which helped. Feeling good, I convinced Helen to let the kids spend the night with their grandparents so we could have some alone time. After a nice dinner, we were curled up in bed after a fulfilling round of lovemaking, simply talking and cuddling. "What happened to your new venture?" she asked. I had purposefully shielded her from the drama, but I couldn't hide my loss of enthusiasm, so I was a bit surprised it had taken her this long to probe. "Oh, it hit a bump in the road," I answered, purposefully being vague, as I knew she wouldn't understand or support my tactics. "And I had already spent all the money you promised," she teased. "Patience, sweetie," I countered while tickling her ribs. My touch made her squirm and giggle, and when she finally settled in a breathless voice, she said, "I would still like to do something for the church." The next part of my plan took much more effort. For about a month, it consumed all my available hours, with even Helen commenting on my lack of family time. I was able to locate 2 companies that had the capabilities to compete with JD, and which had similar, if not superior, cost structures. I used my contacts at the customer to get them established as vendors, knowing they would have, at a minimum, a detrimental impact on JD's pricing. In addition, through my efforts, I realized one would be an outstanding supplier to fill JD's scope on Neptune if I decided to resurrect that initiative. If the customer suspected what I was up to, they never brought it up and seemed thrilled to improve their supplier base. Surprisingly, and quite contrary to my expectations, JD had been silent about my actions to cut off the suppliers. Then, I learned that the companies I introduced were asked to bid on some competing work, and I was certain I would hear from him. I had even scripted and practiced the message I would deliver that was intended to humiliate him the way he had done with me. Still, all stayed silent, and after almost 6 months had elapsed, the whole situation started to fade from my thoughts. When plotting revenge, first dig 2 graves. There should be a corollary to that message that goes, if you can't follow the advice, at least don't seek revenge on someone meaner than you. Unfortunately, the solace I took in JD's silence was about to be interrupted, and I would learn that I was only using conventional weapons while he went full thermonuclear. "Hey, Chief, we should talk," JD said over the phone. I had recognized his number, so I was prepared and replied, "JD, how's business?" "Oh, you know, up and down," he said, and then added seriously, "Let's get together." "JD, I have absolutely no interest in never seeing you again. I think things have ended as they should, and I'm moving on," I answered. "Let me tell you, you want to come see me," he said, slipping back into his condescending tone. "No, I'm good," I replied and hung up. After that, I went about my day, giggling to myself several times at my victory. I was just about to head home when I noticed an email from JD. Opening it, I was stunned to see a picture of my wife attached. Helen was standing with her back to the camera, but partially turned so the side of her face was shown. There was no question it was her, but what made it shocking was that she was dressed only in a black thong. The setting, however, wasn't our house. I didn't recognize any of the furnishings or the color of the walls, which left me confused about what I was seeing. However, slowly the reality started to sink in, and knowing it was coming from JD, I suddenly felt it must be sinister. Several times I reached for the keyboard, but each time I backed away. I needed to know more, to somehow gather more information and collect my thoughts before I replied. For that reason, I merely turned off the computer and left for home. On the drive, my thoughts went to my wife's involvement, and I hoped that she would rush to my arms and explain it all away. However, when I walked in the door, both wife and kids acted like it was just another day. My wife was all smiles, and the kids crawled into my lap after dinner while we watched a movie. Later, after she had cleaned the kitchen, Helen joined us with a glass of wine and engaged me in her normal discussion about all that had happened that day. However, while she spoke, my mind refused to let go of the vision of her in the picture. "What else has been going on?" I asked, although it was a first attempt. What I was trying to do was give her the opportunity to come clean and explain things. It failed, as all she did was start talking again about her charitable activities. I tried again when the kids had gone to bed, but that effort was unsuccessful as well. Evidently, my lovely wife was capable of keeping her secret buried while conducting herself in the normal family fashion. In fact, her manner was so relaxed I began to wonder if somehow he had digitally placed her into the picture. I didn't contact JD the next day, as I just didn't want to give the bastard the satisfaction. However, the following morning, I couldn't take it anymore and I dialed his number. "Well, duck me, look who called," he laughed. "Where did you get that?" I asked, unable to think of anything else to say. "Oh, I got a lot more than that," he answered, laughing again. "What the duck did you do, you ducking ah?" I screamed into the phone, no longer able to contain myself. "I ducked you hard. You wanted to play games, and you lost," he replied, no longer laughing. Then, after a second of silence, he continued, "Now, if you don't want your life on display to the world, be here at 3 p.m. today." I was shaking as I set the phone down. And thinking about the dilemma, I realized my choice was either to confront Helen or go to JD's and find out more. Since I was still confused, I decided I would attend the meeting that afternoon at 3 p.m. I pulled open the door of JD's office, and upon entering, I was immediately escorted to a large conference room by the young receptionist. I waited nervously for 10 minutes before JD, along with 2 other men, entered. "I'm glad I'm not you," JD laughed, then continued. "That's Conrad behind you. He's here to make sure you don't get stupid. This is Don. You'll learn more about him in a minute." "What's this all about?" I asked, needing to say something. "You know what it's about or suspect?" JD replied, then reached for a remote, hit a button, and said, "I thought we'd start here." There was a flicker on the screen that covered the far wall, and then a video started instantly. Every muscle in my body tensed as I saw Helen in the arms of Dawn. She was, that I recognized as the one in the emailed picture. Then, with another press of the remote, JD paused the scene. "Your wife is a beautiful woman," he said, looking towards me for a moment before restarting the video. I was stunned when my wife, with no further prodding, moved towards it. I had never seen my wife respond so completely during our lovemaking. And just for a moment, I wondered if it was indeed my wife I was watching. Again, I considered whether they had managed to stage things. Perhaps it was an actress made to look like Helen. I could feel my body tensing. And despite what I just saw, I couldn't accept it. I felt it had to be forced or staged. I just couldn't gauge Helen as a cheater. "What the duck is this? What did you do to her? How did you make her do this?" I spewed forth, no longer able to hold back my outburst. Conrad squeezed my shoulders, and once more, JD looked at him for a moment before replying. "She did it all on her own. I'll explain it all later, but let's watch the movie. It's good. I could probably sell it." "JD, you ducked up fast," I said. My comment only brought a laugh from him. Then he said, "Let's watch the next one." Quickly, he fast-forwarded through the video, and then landed on another scene. This time, my wife was already on the bed with a pair of black heels. Suddenly, I felt the remaining energy drain from my body as it dawned on me that this was an entirely different encounter. In fact, I recall her going out to dinner with the girls on a Thursday night about a month before and wearing the heels. It had struck me at the time that she looked a bit overdressed, but I had put it down to simply not understanding how women did things. Now it appeared she was having an affair. I glanced at JD and Dawn, and when I saw them smiling at me, I knew they had manipulated the exchange to rub my nose in it even more. It was so wrong and so evil that I couldn't fathom how a person could want to act this way. At that moment, I knew I was dealing with a depraved individual capable of anything. Seemingly ignoring my outburst, JD started to speak. "I guess I owe you the details. Let me start by saying that your work to duck me on the Neptune deal was good. I was surprised since I didn't think you had it in you. But you should have known I would just let it sit. That was your duck up, and it was a big one." I fought to hold back the tears while I looked down at the table and thought about it all. It was such a sudden act of destruction to the marriage that I had enjoyed and worked so hard for. Then there was the impact on our kids. How would they respond to a divorce? I wanted there to be an explanation. I wanted desperately for Helen to have some reason, some story that would at least give me hope. But deep down, I knew there was just too much evidence. "What do you want?" I finally forced out in total defeat. As soon as I spoke the words, I could see JD's expression change. Now he looked serious, and with a slow nod of his head, he started, "What do I want? You ducked with me, and I won. Then why am I here?" I said angrily. "You're here so I could see the look on your face," he replied. Then, after a deep breath, he started again. "But now that you know I won, I have a proposition for you." "What?" I asked. "I've got enough video of your wife that it would ruin her and embarrass you and the rest of y'all's family. Needless to say, the church wouldn't be amused. Now, I'm willing to trade all the stuff to you in exchange for you signing over your business," he explained. "Duck you," I replied. "I'd understand if you said no. Of course, that probably means divorce, especially when all the material gets out. But who could blame you since she turned out to be such an easy ducking slot?" It'd be messy, and your kids would learn the truth when they got older. Also, you'd look like who couldn't keep his woman, he taunted. When I didn't reply, he continued, now, if you see it my way, you'd at least get out with your dignity. Of course, losing the business hurt, but you could start again. JD, you are the most ducked-up person I've ever known. What if I go to the police? I threatened. You aren't going to the police. Now, think about it tonight. And tomorrow at 9 a.m., be back here with your answer, he replied. And with his words, I felt Conrad's hands leave my shoulders. Update 3. My hands were shaking so hard it was difficult to drive. The entire way, I thought about what I would do when I came face to face with my wife. I knew I had to hold back my temper as violence would only create a deeper hole. But I was truly clueless as to what to say and how to react. I sat in the driveway for 15 minutes before I was able to summon the courage to enter the house. Hi, honey, my wife called out when I entered the kitchen, and looking past the dining room, I could see our kids in front of the TV watching cartoons. Sensing something was amiss, she asked, is everything all right? Yeah, Helen. After dinner, we need to talk, I said, and for a moment, I saw panic in her eyes. Okay, she replied and turned back to the stove. Helen took her time putting the kids to bed, which made me wonder if she suspected the subject of our discussion. Finally, after I was sure they were asleep, I nodded for her to join me. And she, together with me, moved to the living room sofa. Look, I'm not going to beat around the bush. Are you having an affair? I asked. No, of course not. Why would you ask such a thing? She replied, but in her eyes, I could see the guilt. Helen, who is Dawn? I said suddenly. The guilt in her eyes turned to panic. How did you? Look, I can explain. Go ahead, I said as calmly as possible. When she became silent, I'm sorry, she said after several failed attempts to speak and started to sob. I let her cry until she started to regain some control. Then I asked, tell me what happened. I met him at church, and I don't know. We got to know each other. And it just happened, she forced out. You had sex with him? I clarified, and she nodded her head. So, how long has it been going on? I whispered. There were several seconds of silence before she whispered back, too many. Do you love him? I made myself ask, wondering which answer was best. No, she replied instantly. No more, Helen, I said and started to rise, suddenly feeling exhausted. How did you know? She asked. I just did, I said. The drive to JD's the next morning was the hardest thing I had ever done. I had decided to sign over the business, deciding that dragging everything out into the open served no purpose. If I was going to divorce Helen, I far preferred to do it quietly. However, I was deeply concerned about my kids first and then employees. Many employees had been with me since the start, and I had no belief that JD would treat them fairly. What's the answer? He asked, dispensing with formalities as he brusquely entered the conference room with Conrad right behind. I'll let you have the business, but I want all the stuff, everything, I told him. I thought that's what you'd say. So it's all in that box, he said, nodding towards a container at the end of the table. Then he added, I've got no use for it anyway. I've seen it enough. Then he pushed a piece of paper in front of me. Even though I knew I should probably consult an attorney, I just wanted it over. Reading through it quickly, I saw that he had structured the transaction as a payout of earnings that I knew would never come but which provided him with tax cover. I signed it. JD was smiling at me, and I was about to leave when he said, before you go, take the disc marked number 34 and watch it. I gave him a hard stare as he turned and left, closing the door behind him. Despite feeling manipulated, I picked through the box and collected the disc. Duck you, I said and stepped past him. By the way, she's called Dawn twice so far this morning. We agreed it was over. I can't control your wife, and Dawn no longer works for me, he laughed. Final update. I was seething as I made my way to the office to announce the change. It took several hours of meetings and explanations before I was finally able to depart. When I finally got home, Helen was watching TV with the kids, and her nervous demeanor left me doubting whether I still had a wife. I told her I thought it would be best if she took the kids to her parents for the night, as we had some serious talking to do. With a quick nod, she said she'd make it happen. An hour later, she was back and met me in the living room. I already had the disc loaded in the player, so with a simple press, the TV came on with the scene of her and Dawn discussing impregnation. How did this start? I asked, ignoring her words. No, I don't know, she answered. When's your next period start? I said. Sunday, I think, she replied. And you've been with him and me, so you might be, I stated. Yes, she answered softly. Let me see your phone, I demanded. After working through the screens, I got to the recent calls and saw that 5 connections had been made that day. Is this his number? I asked. Yes, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. I could see her body start to shake. Did you see him today? I demanded. No, she answered emphatically, as if somehow it absolved her of all her sordid indiscretions. Why did you talk to him? I asked. I wanted to know what was going on, she replied. It took 5 calls. I asked. What else did you discuss? I don't know, that's it, she answered nervously. Really? You didn't ask him if he was in love with you? You didn't tell him you were in love with him? You didn't ask him about his past child? I fired at her rapidly. I remembered the intimacy she had shown in the tapes, and knew to her, their connection was more than casual sex. The look she gave me let me know I had been correct. And some or all of the things I had stated had been discussed. I'm sorry, was all she could force out. Let me tell you what happened, I started, but paused so she could wipe her eyes, then continued as calmly as I could. Remember that business thing I was working on a few months ago? Well, I was working it with a guy named J.D. Thornton. He tried to cheat me, and when I found out, I did some things to get even. He couldn't handle that I got back at him, so he hired your boy Don to seduce you as payback to me. They were intentionally trying to destroy our lives. Oh my God, no, Helen whimpered. Yes, and I had to see all the videos they made and them laughing about what an easy duck you were, I explained. She cried as the tears let forth, but in her words, I wasn't sure if her emotion was for me or Dawn. I left her on the sofa with her head in her hands and went to make a drink. Just as I was pouring the bourbon, I heard her moving. When I returned, she had disappeared to the back of the house. A few minutes later, she appeared dressed to go out, and instinctively, I knew where she was heading. You're going to him? I challenged her. I need to check on the kids, she said, although we both knew she was lying. She didn't return until the next morning, and I never tried her cell nor challenged her. When she arrived, I was too emotionally spent, and although I knew we were likely done, we went through the next few days without any further discussion. Our interactions were forced, and to deal with the awkwardness, most of our attention was directed towards the kids. A week had elapsed since our discussion when I received a text from JD with an attached link. As soon as I opened it, I could tell it was a video, so I stopped it, then attached it to an email and sent it to myself to open on the desktop computer. The scene opened with her in Dawn's arms, crying uncontrollably. She was wearing the clothes she had put on when she left me to check on the kids, so it appeared she had gone straight to her lover. Baby, calm down, Dawn's clear voice came through. Why did you do it? Helen forced out. Don't worry, it's okay, he answered evasively. Don't leave me. What if I'm... She started but stopped mid-sentence. Are you? He quickly responded, as a smile came to his face. I don't know, maybe, she said. The video continued. Surprisingly, she followed his direction, and they started the same as they did before. I moved out a few days later, never even bothering to tell Helen. I saw the recent tape. There really was no point, as in the end, it was just more of the same. Dawn cut off all contact with her, which set her into a tailspin, and she actually followed him to Las Vegas to try and keep things going. But after a few weeks, the reality finally hit, and she returned. Miraculously, she didn't get pregnant, which was a relief, although part of me thought it would serve her right if she ended up with a kid from one of them. Of course, her parents reached out multiple times, as did the priest from the church, pleading with me to forgive and think of the family. They knew her indiscretions were significant, although I doubt they understand the depth of her depravity. I stood firm, offering no indication of hope, and finally, the calls stopped. Now I spend most of my time trying to resurrect my business. With the pending divorce, money is quite tight, which has put me in strained living conditions. But I have made some good progress. Fortunately, I maintain good relations with my customers, and JD seems to be purposefully trying to disrespect them. It will take time, but I'm confident things will work out business-wise. Because of kid things, I see Helen at least once a week, and almost every time, she makes a plea for us to sit down and talk things through. On a few occasions, she's even attempted a seduction, although I've made it clear that it's not in the cards. I could forgive her for the sex, even though it would be difficult, but it was clear that she was ready to leave me for Dawn, and that's not something I can forget. So much change so fast has been very hard to accept, and I seem to live in an emotional roller coaster world. Unfortunately, a little voice in my brain continues to whisper a message that everything started because of my need for revenge and that my wife is an unfortunate victim of these events. So remember the prophetic words of wisdom. When plotting revenge, first dig 2 graves. Thank you for being a part of our journey, and we look forward to sharing more powerful stories with you in the future. We encourage you to subscribe to our channel and stay connected with our community. Remember, this channel exists because of your support, and I want it to be a place where we can all come together, learn, and have a great time. Your feedback is vital, and I appreciate every single suggestion and comment you provide. Take care of yourself, and see you soon. That's the story. If you liked it, please support us with a like as well as subscribe to our channel. Write in the comments what you think about the story. Thank you for being here with us.
Let's begin. The weight of loss is an unpredictable thing. It sneaks up on you in moments that should have been simple, moments that don't ask for gravity, but become suffocating all the same. As I stood before the small, white casket, my fingers trembled against the edges of the podium where I was meant to speak. Behind me, the church hummed with the low murmur of people offering condolences to one another, but I could hear their questions beneath the noise. Noah's blanket, the one he clutched through every long hospital night, lay folded neatly atop him inside the casket. I had made sure of it. It wasn't just a blanket. It was his comfort, his protection, and now it had to be mine too, because I had failed him. I had failed to give him the safety he deserved. "You can do this," my mother had whispered as she placed her hand on my arm earlier. But even her presence couldn't stem the weight of what was happening. As I gazed out at the sea of faces in the church, I noticed every familiar outline from our small town. There was the butcher who had sold us chicken wings when Noah first learned to cook with me. Mrs. Halford, who had gifted Noah a book on sea creatures that had become his prized possession. Each face carried a fragment of Noah's short life, yet all I could feel was their judgment. They were whispering, I could sense it, their gazes darting between one another and the empty space beside me. No parent should ever bury their child, and yet here I was, reciting words about Noah's joy and resilience while the person who was supposed to be my anchor sat absent. My voice trembled only slightly as I described his favorite pastime, coloring white roses with food dye. I paused, the memory of his giggles echoing so vividly in my mind that it was almost unbearable. He'd always loved the blue dye most, claiming it reminded him of the ocean he dreamed of visiting one day. But even as I forced the words out, a second narrative played in my head, louder and more cruel. Where is Lydia? Why isn't she here? The whispered speculations of the townspeople were nearly audible, laced with judgment and pity. Everyone had been polite enough to offer sympathetic nods and brief hugs, but I could feel their stares burning into my back, dissecting my life. Then there was the photo, the one I'd received just minutes before stepping into the church. Lydia, lounging beside a sparkling pool with a drink in her hand and a smug-looking man at her side. The man looked younger, his confidence oozing out of the frame. Lydia, on the other hand, looked nothing like the woman I had once built my life with. The message accompanying the image was simple. Thought you should see what your wife is really doing today. A concerned friend. The words had taunted me ever since, searing themselves into my mind as I replayed the moment over and over. She wasn't in a business meeting, as she claimed. She wasn't here, mourning with me, or even pretending to care. She was sipping cocktails in paradise, her betrayal as glaring as the Hawaiian sun shining on her face. The funeral reception felt like walking through a haze. Voices blended into one another, every condolence sounding rehearsed. Plates of untouched food cluttered the tables, casseroles and baked goods brought by neighbors who didn't know how else to contribute to my grief. I moved like a ghost through the room, nodding stiffly as people whispered, "He's holding up so well," or, "Poor Mark, this must be so hard without Lydia." Their pity was suffocating, pressing against my chest like a vice. In the corner of the room, Margaret and Henry, Lydia's parents, stood as though they were the hosts of this grim gathering. Their sharp gazes flicked toward me every so often, their faces unreadable. They had never approved of me, always quick to find fault in the way I cared for Lydia, as though she were a fragile object I had somehow mishandled. Eventually, Margaret approached me, her saccharine tone failing to mask the disdain beneath. "Mark, you've been so strong today," she said, her voice like the edge of a knife. "It's a shame Lydia couldn't be here, but you know how hard this has been for her." Her words hit me like a slap. Hard for her? My voice came out colder than I intended. Hawaii must be a welcome distraction from all this difficulty. Margaret's expression faltered, just for a moment. "Grief makes people act out of character," she said softly, recovering her composure. "You should try to understand." The weight of her condescension made my chest tighten. I turned away before I could say something I'd regret, setting down my glass of water with more force than necessary. I caught sight of my mother across the room. She gave me a subtle nod, her presence grounding me as it always had. Later that night, the house was eerily silent. The reception had ended, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echoes of everything left unsaid. Noah's room called to me like a beacon, and I found myself standing in the doorway, staring at the neatly made bed and the stuffed penguin he'd loved so much. I picked it up, the weight of it sparking a fresh wave of grief. He had carried it everywhere, even to his hospital appointments. It was worn now. It seemed slightly frayed, but it was unmistakably his. I set it gently back on the pillow, my hand lingering for a moment before turning away. As I stepped into the master bedroom, my gaze fell on Lydia's desk. The surface was unusually cluttered, papers scattered in a way that was unlike her meticulous tendencies. Something about the disarray drew me closer. I sifted through the stack, my stomach sinking as I recognized the bold lettering at the top of one document. Life insurance policy. My breath caught. Noah's name was printed as the beneficiary, but it had been crossed out. In its place, Lydia's name was written. The amendment had been made weeks before Noah's passing. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, each one revealing more than the last. Loans had been taken out against the policy, money withdrawn in amounts too large to ignore. The implications hit me like a freight train. Lydia hadn't just abandoned me. She had been planning her escape for months. The next morning, I barely slept. My thoughts churned relentlessly, every new detail fueling the fire inside me. I had planned to spend the day combing through the rest of Lydia's belongings for more answers. But my plans were interrupted when my phone buzzed. "Mr. Adams," a hesitant voice said when I answered. "My name is Maya. I think you and I need to talk." Her voice was unfamiliar, but her urgency was palpable. "Who are you?" I asked, wary. "I know what Lydia's been doing," she said, her tone laced with something close to anger. "And I think you deserve to know the whole truth." Maya directed me to meet her at a small diner on Main Street, a place Lydia had always dismissed as too plain for her tastes. Part of me hesitated. What if this was some cruel prank or an attempt to manipulate me further? But the other part, the part that burned with a need for answers, urged me to go. I grabbed the folder with the life insurance documents and headed out, my determination solidifying with every step. The diner was quieter than I'd expected for a late morning, with only a handful of patrons scattered across booths. The smell of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon lingered in the air, a far cry from the polished environments Lydia always preferred. For a moment, I hesitated at the door, questioning the wisdom of meeting a stranger with nothing but her word to go on. Then I spotted her. She was seated in the corner by the window, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her untouched coffee. Dark auburn hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her jacket looked as though it had seen better days. She didn't notice me at first, but when I approached her table, her gaze snapped up to meet mine. "Maya?" I asked, sliding into the seat across from her. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "You came? That's a good start." I leaned back in the chair, folding my arms. "I don't have time for games. You said you know what Lydia's been doing. Start talking." She studied me for a moment, as if deciding how much she could trust me. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a page filled with hastily scribbled notes. "Your wife," she began, her voice steady but laced with bitterness, "has been seeing my ex-boyfriend, Adam, for over a year. She's been siphoning money to fund their little dream life." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but I kept my expression neutral. "I already know about the affair," I said flatly. "What I want to know is why you're here." Maya smirked, a humorless expression. "Because Lydia's not just having an affair. She's plotting. Adam's been bragging about their plans, about how she's using you to bankroll their future. Hawaii, beachfront property, the works. And she's cutting you out completely." I felt the weight of her words settle over me, the pieces of Lydia's betrayal slotting together into a picture far worse than I'd imagined. Maya slid her phone across the table. "Read this," she said simply. I hesitated, but the anger bubbling inside me overpowered the discomfort. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the messages displayed on the screen. They were text exchanges between Lydia and Adam, each one more damning than the last. "Lydia, the payout came through. It's more than enough. We'll be out of here by the end of the month." "Adam, Maui's waiting, babe. Just don't let him suspect anything." "Lydia, he's too broken to see straight. It's already done." The words blurred as my grip on the phone tightened. I set it down with deliberate care, my voice cold as ice. "Why are you showing me this?" Because Adam's a fool, Maya replied, her voice low and sharp. He thinks Lydia's in love with him, but I've seen this game before. The moment he's no longer useful to her, she'll drop him. Just like she's dropping you. I'm not going to sit back and let her win. Her bitterness was palpable, but so was her conviction. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe she might actually be telling the truth. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. Maya leaned forward, her green eyes narrowing. I want to bring them down. Together, I studied her, searching for any sign of deception. She didn't flinch under my gaze, her expression unwavering. Still, trust didn't come easily. Not after everything I'd learned about Lydia. And why should I trust you? I asked. You shouldn't, she admitted. But you don't have to trust me to use what I'm giving you. I have evidence, bank transfers, flight itineraries, you name it. If you want to stop her, you'll need it. She reached in her bag again, this time pulling out a thick envelope. Everything you need is in here, she said, sliding it across the table. Names, dates, accounts, it's all connected. You just have to decide if you're ready to use it. I stared at the envelope, the weight of it mirroring the heaviness in my chest. If I do this, I said finally, my voice like steel, it's not just for revenge. It's for Noah. For everything she's taken from him. Maya's expression softened slightly, though her resolve didn't waver. Then we're on the same page. Back at home, I sat in the dim light of the study, the envelope resting on the desk before me. I hesitated for a long moment before finally opening it, spreading its contents across the surface. The sheer amount of information was overwhelming. Copies of bank statements showing large withdrawals, emails discussing real estate purchases, and photos of Lydia and Adam together. But the most damning piece was a document detailing the life insurance payout. Lydia had been funneling the money into a joint account with Adam, preparing to leave me with nothing. My hands trembled as I pieced it all together. This wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated theft. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Marcus, I said when he answered. I need your help, and I need it now. Marcus was an old friend turned lawyer, someone I trusted implicitly. When I explained the situation to him, he didn't hesitate. This is bad, Mark, he said bluntly. But it's not unbeatable. If we can prove fraud and intent to steal, we can stop her. I nodded, though he couldn't see me through the phone. I've got the evidence, I said. But I'll need your help to make it stick. Send me everything, he replied. And start documenting every interaction you have with her from this point forward. We're going to fight this, but it won't be easy. As I hung up, a sense of determination washed over me. Lydia thought she could destroy me, but she had underestimated one thing. I wasn't broken. Not yet. The night stretched on as I sifted through the stack of papers Maya had provided, each one heavier than the last. It wasn't just the evidence of Lydia's betrayal that tore at me. It was the memories each revelation stirred. As I pieced together her lies, I found myself tracing back to moments I had ignored, moments that now felt like glaring red flags. Lydia's business trips had begun not long after Noah's diagnosis. I dismissed her sudden absences as her way of coping, convincing myself that she needed the distraction of work to avoid the crushing weight of our son's illness. But now, those absences stood out as something darker. I remembered one evening vividly. It was Noah's 8th birthday, just a few months before his condition worsened. Lydia had missed the small celebration we'd planned at home, claiming a last-minute meeting required her attention. I had believed her then, even excusing her to Noah with promises that she'd make it up to him later. Now, sitting alone in the quiet of my study, I couldn't shake the memory of Noah's small voice asking, "Does Mommy not like birthdays anymore?" The sting of that question felt sharper than ever, cutting through the haze of my anger and grief. The next morning, I called Marcus again, this time with a clearer picture of what needed to be done. I have evidence that she's been moving money into a joint account, I said, pacing the length of my living room. And there's more, flight itineraries, text messages, even photos of her with Adam. It's all here. Marcus was silent for a moment before responding. That's a solid start, but we'll need more if we're going to take this to court. Can you get any witnesses? Someone who can corroborate what's happening. I thought of Maya, her sharp gaze and determined tone as she handed me the envelope. She had been clear about her intentions, and while I didn't fully trust her, I knew she could be a key player in this fight. I might have someone, I said finally. Good, Marcus replied. Reach out to them, and let's get started on building your case. Meeting with Maya again was a calculated risk, but one I knew I had to take. She agreed to meet at the same diner, her expression guarded as I slid into the booth across from her. I need you to testify, I said bluntly, cutting straight to the point. Maya's eyebrows shot up. Testify? Against Lydia? Yes, I replied, my tone firm. You've got the evidence to back up what you're saying, and if you're serious about stopping her, this is the next step. She hesitated, her fingers drumming against the edge of the table. Testifying means putting myself out there, she said slowly. It means risking everything, and I don't exactly have much left to lose. Then why hesitate? I pressed. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she looked like she might refuse. But then she sighed, leaning back in her seat. Fine, she said. I'll do it, but only because I want to see her pay for what she's done. To both of us. As Maya began recounting her relationship with Adam and how it intertwined with Lydia's schemes, the story grew more tangled than I had anticipated. She explained how Lydia had used her charm and intelligence to draw Adam into her plans, convincing him that their future together was worth any risk. She's not just manipulative, Maya said, her voice low. She's calculated. She knows how to twist people into doing what she wants without them even realizing it. Her words struck a chord. I had seen that side of Lydia before, subtle, persuasive, always getting her way without overt confrontation. It was a skill she had perfected over the years, one that I had once admired. Now, it was a weapon she wielded against me. Maya's revelations added new layers to the case Marcus and I were building. Lydia wasn't just selfish. She was orchestrating a campaign to dismantle everything I had built, piece by piece. With Maya on board and the evidence steadily piling up, Marcus moved quickly to file an injunction to freeze the joint accounts Lydia had been siphoning money into. The court granted the request, but the battle was far from over. Lydia's reaction came swiftly. That evening, my phone buzzed with a call from her. I hesitated before answering, my stomach twisting at the thought of hearing her voice. Mark, she began, her tone dripping with faux concern. I just heard about the injunction. What's going on? What's going on? I repeated, my voice cold. You're asking me that after everything you've done? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her scrambling for a response. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally. Don't lie to me, Lydia, I snapped. I have the evidence. I know about the accounts, the affair, the insurance money. I know everything. Her silence was deafening, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was laced with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about, Mark. This is all a misunderstanding. But her words rang hollow, and I ended the call before she could spin any more lies. The night after Lydia's call, sleep was an elusive dream. Her voice echoed in my mind, each word a painful reminder of the woman she'd become. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Noah's face, his innocent smile, his bright eyes that held so much hope even during the hardest days. And now, the betrayal of his memory hung over me like a dark cloud, refusing to let me rest. I found myself back in the study, surrounded by papers and evidence, trying to make sense of everything. Maya's envelope had been a Pandora's box of revelations, each document more damning than the last. One email stood out, a message from Lydia to Adam, discussing their plans to use the life insurance payout as a down payment on a Maui property. Once the sale goes through, we're free, she had written. The words burned in my mind like a brand, searing into my resolve. The next morning, I called Marcus to update him. She knows we've frozen the accounts, I said. She's trying to act like it's all a misunderstanding, but the evidence is clear. What's our next move? Marcus's voice was steady but firm. We keep building the case. The more we can prove, the harder it will be for her to wriggle out of this. And Mark, be prepared. This is going to get ugly. Ugly didn't begin to cover it. Lydia's parents, Margaret and Henry, had always been loyal to her, but now their allegiance felt like an impenetrable wall. They had been silent at the funeral, offering nothing but cold stares and a few clipped words of sympathy. But as the legal battle escalated, their involvement became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, As I was sorting through more of Lydia's documents, my mother approached me with a wary look. "Mark," she said, her voice hesitant, "I think there's something you should know." I looked up, bracing myself. "What is it?" "Margaret and Henry have been sniffing around the house," she said. "I caught them speaking to a realtor last week. They were asking about property values and sale timelines. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Lydia's betrayal wasn't just her own. It extended to her family, who seemed all too willing to support her schemes. My chest tightened as anger welled up inside me. This wasn't just about Lydia anymore. Her parents were complicit, their silence and actions making them just as guilty. Determined to uncover the full extent of their involvement, I began digging into Margaret and Henry's financial records. With Marcus's help, we traced several large withdrawals from their accounts, each one suspiciously timed with Lydia's actions. "They've been funneling money to her," Marcus said during one of our meetings. "Not just for the Maui property, but for other expenses. Legal fees, travel, even personal luxuries." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, each one revealing a deeper conspiracy. Margaret and Henry weren't just enablers. They were active participants in Lydia's plans to dismantle my life. I knew I couldn't avoid confronting them any longer. One evening, I drove to their house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The house was as immaculate as ever, a testament to Margaret's obsession with appearances. When she opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "Mark," she said coolly, "what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to both of you," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Henry appeared in the living room, his face unreadable as he regarded me. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone cautious. I didn't mince words. "I know about the money," I said. "I know you've been helping Lydia, and I want to know why." Margaret's composure faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice laced with indignation. "Don't lie to me," I snapped, my voice rising. "I have the evidence, bank transfers, emails, everything. You've been funding her plans to leave me with nothing. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Henry shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to Margaret. "This isn't what you think, Mark," he said weakly. "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been conspiring with Lydia to destroy everything I have left." The room fell silent, the weight of my accusation hanging in the air. Margaret's mask of control cracked, her voice rising in frustration. "You don't understand, Mark. We were only trying to help Lydia. She's been through so much, losing Noah, dealing with your instability." "Instability?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You think grief is instability? You think burying my son gives you the right to steal from me?" Henry tried to intervene, his tone placating. "Mark, we're all grieving. This isn't easy for any of us." "Don't," I said sharply, cutting him off. "Don't you dare use Noah's death as an excuse for this. You've been enabling her, supporting her lies, and now you're trying to justify it." Margaret's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing. The silence spoke volumes, confirming everything I already knew. The tension in the room was suffocating, the silence stretching until it felt unbearable. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and Henry's gaze fell to the floor, as though the answers I sought could be found in the pattern of the rug. For a brief moment, I thought Margaret might lash out, her composure slipping as her carefully crafted facade began to crumble. "You don't see the full picture," she finally said, her voice trembling but still defiant. "Lydia, she was desperate. She didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to hurt me?" I echoed, my voice rising with each word. "She lied to me, stole from me, and abandoned our son in his darkest moments. Explain to me how any of that isn't hurtful." Margaret's resolve faltered, her shoulders slumping, as though the weight of her own lies had finally become too heavy to bear. "We thought we were helping her," she said, her voice barely audible. "She said you were falling apart, that you couldn't be reasoned with." My chest tightened as I absorbed her words. Lydia had spun her web of deceit so thoroughly that even her parents believed her twisted version of events. Or perhaps they had known the truth all along and simply chosen to ignore it. "You've done enough damage," I said, my tone laced with finality. Stay out of this from now on. If you don't, I'll make sure you're dragged down with her when this all comes to light." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but I was already turning toward the door. Henry called after me, his voice tinged with desperation, but I didn't look back. The drive home felt longer than usual, each mile marked by a new wave of anger and betrayal. My mind raced, replaying the confrontation with Margaret and Henry. Their excuses, their justifications, it was all hollow. They hadn't been trying to help Lydia. They had been complicit in her schemes, enabling her every step of the way. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my resolve had hardened. This wasn't just about exposing Lydia anymore. It was about ensuring everyone who had played a part in this betrayal faced the consequences. Inside, I found my mother waiting in the living room, her expression worried. "How did it go?" she asked, setting down the book she had been pretending to read. "They admitted to helping her," I said bluntly, collapsing onto the couch. Or at least Margaret did. She tried to justify it, of course, but the truth is clear. My mother's face tightened, her hands folding in her lap. "I knew they were meddling," she said softly, "but I didn't think it was this bad. It's worse than I imagined," I admitted. "And now I have to make sure they don't get away with it." The following days were a blur of meetings with Marcus, poring over documents, and coordinating with Maya. The case against Lydia and her parents was growing stronger by the hour, each new piece of evidence adding weight to the legal storm brewing on the horizon. Maya proved to be an invaluable ally, her determination matching my own. She provided more text messages and bank statements, each one painting a clearer picture of Lydia's betrayal. But what struck me most was her insight into Lydia's psychology. "She thrives on control," Maya said during one of our meetings. "She manipulates people to feel powerful, to feel like she's in charge of her own destiny. And when things don't go her way, she cuts her losses and moves on without a second thought." Her words hit uncomfortably close to home, forcing me to confront the reality of who Lydia had become, or perhaps who she had been all along. One evening, as I reviewed the latest batch of evidence Marcus had sent, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but something told me to answer. "Mark Adams?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes," I said cautiously. "My name is Laura," the woman said. "I'm a former colleague of Lydia's. I think I have information that might help you." The call took me by surprise, but I quickly recovered. "What kind of information?" "Lydia didn't just betray you," Laura said. "She's been hiding things from everyone, including the people she worked with. I'm willing to share what I know, but I don't want my name involved. Can we meet?" I hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. The more I uncovered, the more it became clear that Lydia's web of deceit stretched far beyond our marriage. Meeting Laura was like uncovering the final piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving. She was hesitant at first, glancing around the cafe nervously before settling into her chair. "I worked with Lydia for 3 years," she began, her voice low. "She was ambitious, smart, but also ruthless. She didn't care who she stepped on as long as she got what she wanted." Laura's account painted a picture of a woman I barely recognized, a version of Lydia who had been hiding in plain sight. She detailed incidents at work where Lydia had manipulated colleagues, falsified reports, and even sabotaged competitors to climb the corporate ladder. But what caught my attention most was Laura's mention of a private account Lydia had used to funnel company funds for personal expenses. "It was subtle," Laura explained, "small amounts here and there. But over time, it added up. I think she was preparing for something big." The implications were staggering. Lydia hadn't just betrayed me. She had built a life of lies on a foundation of deception. Laura's revelations were a game changer. Armed with her insights, I met with Marcus the next day to discuss the implications. As I laid out what I'd learned, his expression shifted from focused to deeply concerned. "This isn't just fraud within your marriage," he said, tapping a pen against the folder in front of him. "If what Laura says is true, Lydia's actions at her workplace could bring corporate charges against her. That might strengthen your case, but it also complicates things." "How so?" I asked, leaning forward. "Corporate fraud means federal oversight," Marcus explained. "If the company decides to press charges, they'll take precedence. But if we work strategically, we can leverage this information to corner Lydia even further." It was a delicate balancing act, but one I was willing to navigate. Every new piece of evidence brought me closer to ensuring she couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. Maya, ever the determined ally, jumped at the chance to dig deeper. "Let me look in her workplace," she offered during one of our meetings. "I know people who might have connections. If she left a trail there, I'll find it." I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much I could trust her. But the fire in her eyes was undeniable. "Do it," I said finally. "The more we uncover, the better." While our investigation deepened, Lydia made her next move. It came in the form of a carefully worded legal letter, delivered by courier one afternoon. The letter accused me of harassment and attempted defamation, a blatant attempt to discredit my efforts and turn the tables in her favor. I read the letter twice, my anger growing with each word. It was classic Lydia, turning the narrative to paint herself as the victim. I called Marcus immediately, forwarding him a copy of the letter. "She's playing dirty," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "She's desperate," Marcus replied calmly. "This is a scare tactic, nothing more. Stick to the plan, and don't let her rattle you. The truth is on your side." Despite his reassurances, the letter weighed heavily on me. Lydia wasn't going down without a fight, and her willingness to weaponize the legal system only reinforced how far she was willing to go to protect herself. Maya's investigation yielded surprising results. She uncovered a former employee at Lydia's company who had been quietly let go after questioning discrepancies in financial reports. His name was Eric, and he agreed to speak with me on the condition of anonymity. When we met at a small park outside of town, Eric was visibly nervous, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "Lydia was smart," he said. "She knew how to cover her tracks, but she got sloppy toward the end. I found a series of payments that didn't add up, small amounts at first, but they started growing. When I brought it up, I was told to back off." "By whom?" I asked, my heart pounding. "The higher-ups," Eric replied. But it was clear Lydia was behind it. She had too much influence to be questioned. Eric's testimony added another layer to the case, one that Marcus was eager to incorporate. "This strengthens our position," he said after reviewing Eric's statements. "If we can connect these actions to her personal accounts, it's game over." The day of the court hearing arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread. Lydia, flanked by her parents and a team of lawyers, exuded her usual confidence as she entered the courtroom. But for the first time, I saw something else in her expression: fear. The proceedings were intense, with Marcus presenting our case piece by piece. He outlined Lydia's financial manipulations, her affair, and the conspiracy involving her parents. Maya and Eric's testimonies proved invaluable, their accounts painting a damning picture of Lydia's actions. When it was Lydia's turn to speak, she delivered a carefully rehearsed plea, painting herself as a grieving mother who had made mistakes in the wake of tragedy. But the evidence against her was overwhelming, and her performance rang hollow. By the time the judge delivered the verdict, Lydia's composure had crumbled. The court ruled in my favor, freezing her assets and granting me full ownership of the house. The life insurance payout was redirected to a foundation in Noah's name, ensuring his memory would live on in a meaningful way. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of paperwork, media attention, and quiet moments of reflection. While the victory brought a sense of closure, it didn't erase the scars left by Lydia's betrayal. I channeled my energy into the foundation, working tirelessly to ensure it made a tangible difference in the lives of families facing the same struggles we had endured. Each grant awarded, each child helped, felt like a small piece of Noah's legacy finding its place in the world. On a crisp autumn morning, I visited his grave, a bouquet of blue-dyed roses in hand. As I knelt by the headstone, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. "I kept my promise, buddy," I whispered, my voice steady. "Your memory is safe, and your legacy will help so many people." "You were right. I'm stronger than they thought." The wind rustled the leaves around me, carrying with it a sense of renewal. The storm was over, and while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew I was ready to face it.